Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to start off with talking about spring and early summer plants. First, I do want to mention the Nebraska Pollinator Habitat Certification Program. We started this about 5 years ago, and it's to encourage people to plant pollinator habitats. And the list of plants that I'm going to be talking about come from this list. So even if you decide not to certify, it's got a great plant list for you to look at. So I hope you take some time to look at that site. I want to remind you that it's important to plant plants through the whole growing season, March through October. And when you're planting, it helps if you plant in groups of 5 or 7 or more, or do a mass planting. It just kind of depends on your location and what you have available. But by planting in groups, we found that really helps our pollinators. So I'm going to start off with bulbs. We've found that spring is sometimes hard to find plants that bloom in the spring for us to put in our habitats. So I really wanted to focus on spring flowering bulbs because they're one of our earliest flowers, and they are great for pollinators, especially the ones that are out early. So one of the earliest pollinator plants, snowdrops, and they are blooming, one of the first that you see. So as soon as the snow melts, you're seeing snowdrops. So February, March is when they're blooming. They are not native to the US, they're from Europe, but so is the European honeybee. So when the temperatures are above 45 degrees, the honeybees are out foraging. They're looking for plants, and so snowdrops are there. And this is one of my favorite flowers, so I have a lot in my landscape, and I love watching the honeybees early in the spring visit them. So this one is one that is great for mass planting. And it's just, it lets you know spring's on the way. So that's why it's one of my favorites. Another early spring is crocus. There are a lot of different colors for crocus: purple, yellow, white, striped. And they're, again, another one that is great for mass plantings. So it's great for our early bees. Honeybees do visit them, and they're just a really nice ground cover and great color early in the spring when we're waiting for our other plants to bloom. So a crocus is another one that would be great as a mass planting and early in the spring. So Siberian squirrel, or Scilla, a lot of times you hear it called that, is one that is also early, March and April. It's a little taller plant, 4 to 6 inches, and it's also European. But again, the honeybees do visit it, and I just love the color of this plant. Just beautiful blue flowers early in the spring, great for mass plantings. There's a couple properties around Lincoln where they have, it's almost like a lawn. It's so much of the Siberian squirrel, and you just look forward to seeing that bloom in the spring each year. It can handle full sun or part shade, and it's just one of our prettiest bulbs that you can have. And it's just the color is very unique, and you don't see many other bulbs with that bright blue color. Gloria the Snow, another just beautiful little bulb. What's nice with this one is different colors. There's pink, white, and blue, and very well adapted for Nebraska. It's 3 to 6 inches tall and blooms March through April. And one thing that is nice to know is that it can tolerate being around black walnut. So you can, if you have black walnut trees, it can be under or near them. So that's an added bonus. but beautiful little flowers. It does, and with most bulbs, they do multiply. I wouldn't say that any that I've mentioned are aggressive in any way, but they do multiply. And if you want to, you know, dig some up in the fall and move them to other locations, you can do that real easily with these little bulbs. Striped squill, another one of my favorites. I think the flowers are just fascinating with the white and the blue stripes. This one is a little taller, 6 to 8 inches, and does well in full sun. And this is one where I've seen butterflies visit. We have a couple butterflies that overwinter as adults. These butterflies will find places to crevices, maybe under bark, sometimes in firewood that is stacked outside. And so they're out fairly early if it's warm. So they are looking for plants to forage on. So I caught this red admiral visiting my my striped squirrel a few years ago. So, you know, it really is beneficial to have these early blooming bulbs in your landscape, and plus they're just so pretty. So this one is a fun one to have with, because it's just a unique flower that's really different from anything else. Grape hyacinth, Muscari, another very attractive bulb, unique flower, comes in blue and white, and then there's even one that's 2 shades of blue. Really nice for mass planting, and about 6 to 8 inches tall. Starts blooming in April and can handle sun or part shade, but just it does, the flower looks like a little grape, you know, a little clump of grapes together. So it's a unique flower and very pretty. So move into one of our earlier blooming perennials, pasque flower. This one is not native to the United States, but it is found throughout Nebraska. It is adapted very well. Blooms early March and April, 6 to 10 inches tall, and just beautiful flowers and beautiful foliage. It's just very ferny and soft and just very attractive even after it's done blooming. So this one really looks nice in groupings or in clumps. And it's a nice little plant that has a nice mound effect. So really nice, very early perennial. Trees definitely are very beneficial to pollinators. Our eastern redbud, which is native to North America, is one of our early blooming flowering trees. And at least in Lincoln, they were just gorgeous this spring. I hope they were as beautiful in surrounding communities in Omaha as well. But it was just a beautiful, perfect year for them. Beautiful pink, and there is also a white tree also. They're a little harder to find, but the eastern redbud is one that will seed itself. So if you have room for more trees, you can transplant the seedlings. I know I've done that a few times. One of my favorite trees, just because of, again, early blooming. You know, you're just coming out of winter and you're just ready to see some color. So this one is does well in full sun, but also part shade. Can handle being, you know, kind of partial understory tree, and only gets 20 to 30 feet tall, and has a longer bloom period. It's several weeks, April through May. I've seen it where it's advertised as deer tolerant, but we've had 3 small ones that we put in our Cherry Creek habitat that is behind our Lancaster County Extension Office, and the deer they've unfortunately damaged the trees a bit. They've chewed on the young branches. So I think if there's not much else to eat, they will chew on them. So I did want to mention that because I have seen it listed as deer tolerant. This is one of my favorite flowers because it's just a bright, almost, bright sunshine yellow. The Prairie Ragwort. It is a native to Nebraska. Probably won't find it in the garden centers, possibly, but you probably have to order seed, or if you happen to have someone who has it that is willing to share. But this is a true wildflower, and just beautiful. And of course, the early bees love it, and it's just bright yellow flowers. It's a smaller plant, only 6 to 12 inches, but a lot of times you'll see it in the ditch growing. I think it's in some of the seed mixes that the state has planted, and so it's one to look for this month. It should be blooming now, so you should be able to see it if you're out, in a more rural area. But you should be able to find it in some seed mixes and those catalogs that carry native wildflowers. So if you can find this one, give it a try. This is a shrub, New Jersey tea. It's fragrant and has very unique, pretty white flowers. It can handle some part shade, full sun. This is native, so eastern to central United States. A smaller shrub, 3 to 4 feet, and it blooms May through June. But just a really nice, attractive plant. I like this as a landscape plant too because it can handle some shade. A lot of times I get calls from people that are looking for shrubs that will help pollinators, but need some, be able to tolerate some shade. So this one is a nice one for that, and it's native, so that is a bonus too. So this might be one to consider. Comfrey is an herb. It has really unique, beautiful flowers, white to pink to purple. And bumblebees, from what I found, really love this plant. It will spread and kind of naturalize itself, and it's drought tolerant, so that is nice. It can handle some part shade, full sun. Gets 1 to 2 feet tall, so it's a bigger plant. I've seen some blooming now, so but I just love the color of it, and how the flowers kind of change as they mature. But really nice for bumblebees, larger bees, and great for May, June blooming. Baptisia, another one of my favorites, and a favorite of bumblebees. A few years ago, I was down in Nebraska City visiting in May, and there found a big planting of Baptisia, and the bumblebees were just all over it. I had such a great time taking pictures because it was amazing. The queens were out foraging, and they just love this plant. So if you like bumblebees, this is a definite one you should have. Found throughout Nebraska. It's native, can handle the full sun. It's a big plant, 3 to 4 feet. So you need to give this plant some room. If you can plant multiple plants, I'd recommend it because it's just gorgeous. I love this plant. May through June, and it's one that once it's established, try and put it where it needs to be, and so you don't have to move it. It's a bit hard to move. If you've got purchasing small plants, you shouldn't have a problem, but definitely one to try because and just beautiful flowers. They're pea related to the pea family, and so that's how well the flowers look, and they're just gorgeous color. So I hope this is one that can end up in your landscape, because this one is just beautiful. Wild plum, and this one's definitely native to North America, and early blooming, small tree. And if you have acreage or a farm, this one is great for native pollinators, for bees. We have some that are kind of down from our habitat, and very fragrant. They're wonderful in the spring, and I love to walk down to see them and see what bees are visiting. But if you have room for wild plums, they do obviously do very well. And you also could have edible fruits. If you like wild plums to eat, or you've got wildlife that visits your habitat, this is just a great plant to have. It does sucker, and you can get little clumps that can grow into larger clumps of wild plums. So give it some room so it can do that. But it's just a gorgeous plant to have early blooming, and then great for pollinators, and then you get the fruit as a bonus. Another great plant is a purple poppy mallow. It blooms, starts in May, but it blooms throughout the summer. So it's great because of that, because it's a long blooming. Very beautiful dark pink flowers, very unique color, and great ground cover. It takes a little while to get established. So you have to be a little patient with this one, but once it does, it's tough. It can handle drought. It can handle traffic. It can handle other plants growing around it. It will once it's established, it should always be there. Likes full sun. It will spread, but I wouldn't call it aggressive. It's just a really nice native plant that has just a great flower color. I think that's and you'll notice it when it's blooming. It'll really pop out, and so that is, I think, an added bonus when you've got something that's more unique of a color. Another native tree to North America that pollinators love is the American linden. It's a beautiful tree that gets 50 to 80 feet tall, blooms in June, and I would say that the flowers really aren't noticeable, but what you do notice is the scent, because it has a very sweet scent, but the flowers really aren't that showy. One drawback is Japanese beetles really like lindens. And so if you have Japanese beetles in your community, maybe linden wouldn't be your first choice of trees to plant. But if you have an acreage, I'd still try and get one out, because the bees love it. The bumblebees, all bees really like this plant, and it is a native tree. So it's one to consider. Penstemons, there are several different types of native penstemons. I just picked one to talk about tonight, but all of them are wonderful plants. I picked the shell leaf. I love the leaves on it. I think they're really unique, and then the flowers are just very big and bold. So this is one of my favorites, and it's a taller one, 2 to 3 feet, native to the central U.S. Can handle full sun, and just this light, beautiful lavender color that it has. So if you can add penstemons, I really suggest that, because they're just gorgeous flowers. They're very unique, and bumblebees, again, really like them. But there's many to pick from. So definitely look at the list and check out and see what else there is for penstemon, but they're just a beautiful, unique flower. And that's my list for spring and early summer. So thank you for going through my list with me, and I can't wait to see Kelly's list. She's going to do summer and fall. So thank you, everyone. I'll stop sharing there.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen here in a minute. So this would be a great time for everybody to stand up, stretch, maybe do a couple jumping jacks, and I'll be ready in a jiff. Okay, are you seeing my screen? The correct mode?
No, we are not.
Well, that's weird. Okay, here we go. I missed one step. There's always
There
that
we
step.
go.
Are you seeing it in presentation mode?
Yes,
No.
yes,
No notes, right?
no notes. You're
Okay.
good to go.
Because I can't see, I can see what I can see, but not what you guys can see. So, okay, well, thank you, Mary Jane. That was a good cover of plants. There's not as many early spring through June blooming plants. So I'm doing the July to October. Some of them might be mid-June, but mostly July to October. And there's numerous plants to select from during that time period. So I'm going to dive right in and get started. I do want to point out these publications. These are Neb guides printed for Nebraska. So those of you that are not in Nebraska, Iowa, they should be fine. But in particular is the butterfly gardening Neb guide. We have one on wildflowers for the home landscape, for perennials for sunny sites. We had a question ahead of time about drought tolerant plants. So these perennials in water-wise landscapes, many of them would be considered very drought tolerant. And we also have a Neb guide on annuals for Nebraska landscape. So in all of these, this is the one from Plants to Attract Butterflies, which of course will, in a nutshell, attract almost all of the pollinators or a good number of them. Then you can see how they list them out alphabetically, scientific names, some varieties. This was published in 2012, so there's a lot of newer varieties that are available now. But many of these are excellent, excellent ones to try. Bloom color height, so you can see there's good, it tells if it's a larval source. So we want to make sure we're planning for the larva as well as the adult or a nectar source. So, and those can be found at extensionpubs.unl.edu and just type in one of those names I shared there, butterfly gardening, wildflowers, perennials, and you'll be able to access these. Okay, for the summer bloomers, keep in mind, there's annuals, herbs. I'm going to cover a couple of shrubs. There's not a lot of summer blooming shrubs. Most of them are spring blooming, but I'll cover a couple. And then some of our popular perennials for pollinators. Annuals sometimes get a little bit of a bum name. They attract a lot of pollinators, maybe a few more butterflies than bees or other pollinators, but there's some excellent ones for those insects as well. What I like about annuals is you can if you have a bare spot here and there, a perennial that's died back, or maybe you had to divide it, and now you have some bare space. Annuals are great for tucking in, long season of bloom. And of course, they're great for growing in containers. And I took this picture in the Haymarket in Lincoln, and I'm sure that butterfly was very appreciative of the nectar that it was able to get in that downtown area with all that cement. So of the annuals, like I said, they're kind of viewed as being better for butterflies in many cases, which is great and fine, and maybe not as good for some of the other pollinators. But the ones I have listed here are great for those as well. And there's so many to cover. So our job is to provide research-based or science-based information. So University of Minnesota did a 4-year study a few years ago. And what I'm going to focus on, and with limited amount of time tonight, is they came up with 9 annual flowers that they found to be the most attractive to pollinators of the more than 30 varieties. So not just attractive, but attractive to pollinators. I didn't say much about herbs. Herbs are great to include in gardens, pollinator gardens. Now, like basil, oregano, rosemary that we're growing usually for the leaves, we typically tell people don't let them bloom because you start lowering the quality of the flavor and the taste. So if your main goal is culinary, keep that in mind. But if your main goal is pollinators, plant them in the garden and let them bloom, and they'll do a great job. So again, most of these annuals that I'm covering were the ones that the University of Minnesota found to do well. But salvias are great pollinator plants. In the Minnesota trial, this pink jewel, which was an All-American selection in 2012, did quite well. And the blooms appear about 2 weeks earlier than other pink salvia. And to be named an All-American selection, it has to have something unique about it. So that was one of the main reasons it was named that. But that's great for the pollinators if they can feed for 2 weeks longer on these plants. Purple fairy tail salvia is a purple one. There's a lot of purple salvia, the perennial ones and so on. But this one is a little bit of a unique shaped flower. And the foliage is kind of more of a rosette with those larger leaves. But I really like this purple fairy tail. And it did quite well in the Minnesota trials. Malampodium is one that we probably don't hear as much about, but this is a very prolific bloomer. And that's one thing we do want for our pollinators. We want them to be able to get a good meal at one stop. So Mary Jane was talking about planting and massing, at least 5 to 7 plants. At least if you can find a plant that has masses of blossoms, you could get by with 2 or 3 possibly. So it's kind of nice compact plant, about 24 inches by 24 inches. In the Minnesota trial, they did Showstar, and that it made the top 9 of the 30 that they were testing. And this one, a complementary plant, would be my favorite salvia. My favorite salvia is Victoria Blue, and that I've grown for years because it performs great for me. And I can attest in here, it has a butterfly in it, but it is loaded with bees, frequently in beetles as well, but mostly butterfly and bees. And it would make a great complementary plant in the garden with the Malampodium. They would look well together and bloom at about the same time to get that mass of blooms. Zinnias. Zinnias are great annual flowers for pollinators and lots of blooms with little effort. For those of you that have grown zinnia, you know they're quite easy to grow, and direct seed in the garden and they'll come back or grow and do great and have a nice mass of blooms. Very, very little effort. Pretty tough plant. They have a nice landing pad, we say, especially for butterflies, but other insects too. They like that wide and open. It's easy to access those, the anthers and the nectar. Nice landing pad for those butterflies. I loved in the University of Minnesota, they described zinnia as that wide and open, making it easy for pollinators to do business with the flower. So I had to put that in there because I liked the description. In the trial, the one that they trialed was Envy Zinnia, which is actually a green to yellow-green bloom, and it is an heirloom. It's been around for quite a long time. I couldn't find a great picture of it, so I used the University of Minnesota's picture, so it is a little bit blurry there. But that is the one that was the top 9 of the 30. But zinnias overall, just about all of the zinnias. Some of them that are the really tight double forms might not be quite as well. You want these more open, more of a single type bloom. Usually is a little better for our pollinators. Sunflowers, the last 2, that Music Box Mix and the Lemon Queen sunflower were the 2 in the Minnesota trial that did the best. But no, with sunflowers, there are pollen sunflowers and pollen-free sunflowers. So the pollen-free sunflowers will still provide nectar for our insects, but that pollen is so critical and so important for so many of our insects, particularly the bees. They need that for a protein source. So if you're growing the sunflowers, you might want to make note of that. The reason they produce the pollen-free sunflowers is so they wouldn't be so messy in cut flower arrangements, and they wouldn't have the pollen. So great for cut flower, but maybe not as great for our pollinators. So for a pollinator garden, just try to steer clear of the pollen-free sunflowers. A lot of the ornamental ones now are branching type sunflowers, so you get a lot more flowers rather than the old standard confectionery or oil type sunflowers that are really tall. They have one bloom per plant. That one bloom provides a lot of foraging for insects, but the branching ones are obviously going to provide more blooms. And you can see this was one, I apologize, this was one my daughter grew for kindergarten, and she graduated last Sunday. So I didn't write down the name, or I've long since forgotten it, but this is one of the newer branching type, even though it was 17 years ago. All right, I shouldn't say that, 13 years ago. Okay, black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia, I know we typically think of these as being perennials, and many of them are perennial, but Rudbeckia hirta is kind of considered a short-lived perennial, so sometimes it's treated more as an annual or even a biennial. And in the University of Minnesota trial, the orange fudge black-eyed Susan and the prairie sun black-eyed Susan were made that top 9. This is a very long season of bloom, June to September. And if you get the Rudbeckia hirta, the Rudbeckia fulgida, such as Goldstrom, that's more of the perennial one, more of a little bit longer lived perennial. Just to take as an aside, I think this is a lot of fun. You see the words ultraviolet absorbance and reflectance. So Heather Holmes, in her book about pollinators, one of her books about pollinators, really describes many unique things about different flowers and the different pollinators. So she had made note that this black-eyed Susan has the ultraviolet, and some of you may know what I'm talking about, but this is what a bee sees, and this is what we see. So, and that's pretty, I believe this is a Rudbeckia here, but the rest of them you can see what a bee sees, what we see, et cetera, et cetera. So these are viewed as ultraviolet nectar guides. So what it does is they help the bee, they help the insect zero in on where the good stuff is. So they don't have to expend energy crawling all over a larger flower or whatnot to figure out where that good stuff right in the center is, where the nectar and the pollen is. Now, I would say that not all flowers have these ultraviolet nectar guides, but of the ones that do, bees are the ones that can see that. And I love sharing this with kids. Kids just love it. They really get into it, and it makes them more interested in insects, especially bees that they're usually scared of. Okay, I'm going to end on the annuals there. I'm going to mention a couple of shrubs. So there's not a lot of shrubs that bloom later in the summer. Most of our shrubs are spring bloomers, but buttonbush is one that will start blooming in June. And usually it'll say June and July, but I took this picture on the State Fair grounds right at State Fair entry day, and that's late August, about the 3rd week of August. So they will bloom up until August. You can see the unique flower, Sputnik blooms, they're called. And you can see they dry down into kind of a hard, not really a hard ball, but a brownish round ball, which I think continues to add some ornament. Some people may not. This one has beautiful, the foliage stays nice and ornamental all season long. Some of our shrubs, I have a Grefsheim spirea that blooms like crazy, but then the rest of the season, it's kind of ratty looking. So I like shrubs or plants where the foliage, once it's finished blooming, the foliage will continue to look nicer up until it blooms. These are large shrubs. So the ones at the State Fairgrounds, last time I looked or saw, they were probably 7 feet tall. So they can get up to 12 feet. There is one called Sugar Shack, which is only supposed to get about 4 by 4 feet. I have a question mark there because I always say if it says it'll get 4 feet tall, just assume it'll get 5 or 6. It doesn't always pan out, but it seems like shrubs get a little larger than they're advertised to get. I just planted one last spring, so in a few years, I'll let you know how large it is. This is one that tolerates wet soils. I know Kathleen in our first pollinator program talked about rain gardens. And this is one that we do recommend for rain gardens, or if you have particularly wet sites. You still want them to be fairly well drained, but it'll tolerate inundation in a rain garden for up to 48 hours. Bluebeard or blue mist. This is Caryopteris, sometimes called blue mist false spirea, but it is not a spirea. It is one of our subfrutescents, and what we mean by that is the roots, the crown is woody, but the stems, the above ground stems, often winter kill. So this past winter, we had some pretty cold temperatures, so a lot of our subfrutescents did die back to nearly to the ground. And so they kind of act more like a herbaceous perennial when they do that. But this is just a buzz with bees and other insects when it is blooming, and it starts blooming in August. You're going to get your heaviest bloom in August, but it'll bloom into September. Not a real, they probably get, because we cut them back. The one I had in my yard, because I had to cut it back so often, it rarely got up above 2 feet. But if we had a mild winter, then, and I didn't have to cut it back too far, it would get up to 3 feet. These are very, very drought tolerant. You can see kind of that lighter colored grayish foliage, and a lot of times plants with lighter grayish type foliage are considered to be drought tolerant. Not all the time, but often. Okay, so that was a couple of shrubs. Another one would be Seven Suns shrubs. I didn't include it in the PowerPoint, but I was thinking later that I should have. So if you've never heard of Seven Suns shrubs, this is a very tall one as well, probably 12 feet tall. Kind of almost looks like a multiple stemmed tree more than a shrub. But it's another one that'll bloom later in the summer and is noted for being a good pollinator plant. So Seven Suns shrub, if you want to check that one out. Okay, into the perennials. Again, so many plants that bloom in July and September, October. It was hard to decide what to include. So I kind of went with mostly the natives. Bee balm or Monarda. Up here in the upper right-hand corner is purple rooster. And I took this picture in the pollinator garden on East Campus. And I liked it for that deep, deep magenta blossoms. That was a deeper, more vivid color that I had seen on many of our Monardas. This one will tolerate part shade, as you know, but in part shade, it tends to be more susceptible to powdery mildew. That can be an issue on the leaves. So ideally, full sun, you're going to get the most blooming. And you will probably have a little bit less trouble with the powdery mildew if you grow it in full sun where there's good air circulation. Like many perennials, this is one that probably should be divided fairly often. And if you deadhead those spent blossoms after they bloom, you'll get a little bit longer season of bloom. And our native one, of course, is wild bergamot or Monarda fistulosa, and that's lavender and very open to and bees, soldier beetles, so all kinds of beetles you will find on the wild bergamot. And if you're wondering why it's called wild bergamot, the European settlers named it that because it reminded them of a bergamot plant back home, back in Europe, the aroma of it. Okay, butterfly milkweed. A lot of people I know are very familiar with this, but it's an excellent plant, and we need our milkweeds, of course, for our monarch butterflies, and great larval plant. I'd always heard that butterfly milkweed was slow to establish, and if you planted it, it might take 2, 3, 4 years before you saw much for blooming. But I've been planting them and growing quite a few recently. And this one in the upper right-hand corner, this was the 1 year after it was planted. I'm not even sure it was a full year after it was planted, but only 1 year. And it was just loaded with blossoms, did excellent. As I said, a larval plant. Another thing I like about the butterfly milkweed is the pods. I think are very ornamental. They're different than the common milkweed, which is a very good pollinator plant too, but they're kind of narrow, stand upright, kind of that reddish. So I think they're just as ornamental almost as the blossom. So they're tough, as you probably heard, it's tough to transplant because of a deeper taproot. So plant it where you want it to stay. If you're a complementary plant to butterfly milkweed, I think, is Russian sage. And this is one is peekaboo. Russian sage can get very tall, 3-4 foot. And sometimes I think it looks a little scraggly. Great pollinator plant, but if you're needing something a little bit smaller, peekaboo. This was growing at Harmon Nursery down by York. They live, this is a nursery pretty close to York, Nebraska, mainly known for growing daylilies, but they have other perennials. And she had this combination of this peekaboo Russian sage with the butterfly milkweed. And I thought it was a very complementary plants and a neat combination. Great for the pollinators. Of course, our purple cone flowers are good pollinator plants. The cones, bees like to circle around that cone as they're collecting their pollen. I've kind of watched to see if this happens. I haven't actually really seen it. I guess, Jody, you do a lot more insect watching than me. So if you've seen that behavior, let us know, tell us about it. But there's about three or four native pollinator coneflowers, or at least 3. But and they're all excellent for pollinators. Echinacea purpurea is probably the one we most often see in the landscapes and perennial gardens. Pale purple coneflower is another native. Flowers, the petals are a little bit paler pink, which is maybe why it's not quite as popular, and as not as readily available. But they're all excellent for pollinators, whichever one you choose to grow. They can have some trouble with Aster's yellow, where they get the really weird looking. If you've ever seen green, weird, funny looking, that's probably one issue for which there is no control. I do want to mention a couple of the other coneflowers. Gray head coneflower, Radabida. Okay, this is not a purple coneflower. It's a completely different genus. So, but these are good pollinator plants as well. And our prairie coneflower, the red one, is Mexican hat. So any of these would be good in the garden for pollinators. Allium, the native one is nodding onion. Okay, Millennium is not a native perennial, but and I don't think it's Allium surium, so it's not the native one, but it's an excellent one, 2018 perennial plant of the year, and highly noted for being a great pollinator plant. These will self-sow, but they kind of spread nicely. They're easy to control. They don't naturalize too much. But you can see the massive amount of blossoms. So great foraging for our pollinators. And I have to mention the Agastache. Okay, this is giant hyssop is probably the native one. And I'm sorry, this was another one of those pictures that I took where it was not labeled with the variety or cultivar, but it was particularly pretty, especially with the blue grama grass, the seed heads, I'm sorry, that look like little eyelashes. But this would be a nice complementary plant, at least I thought so, because of the difference in shape, plant form, contrasting lavender and a little bit deeper purple. But of the giant hyssop, there's numerous cultivars. Some of Firebird is kind of a reddish, or not reddish, but more of a orangey pink, maybe I would call it, reddish orange. But there's numerous Agastaches out there, and they're great pollinator plants. Swamp milkweed, I really like swamp milkweed. It's getting later in the summer. It really doesn't start blooming until late August and blooms through September. This is another one that will tolerate wet soil, so we use it quite frequently in rain gardens. I took this picture in a rain garden at a school in Omaha. And the only thing that my swamp milkweed in my yard is usually covered with Oleander Aphids, at least on the very tips. And so that does make them look a little bit ratty. But if you like insects, Oleander Aphids are bright, vivid orange, just like the monarch butterflies. So they're kind of fun to watch. I tend to just kind of squish them as I see them. And my fingers are orange most of the summer. And then at some point, I just let them go. Gay feather oleatris, another one of our natives that's listed in just about any pollinator book that you will find for pollinator plants. We have the three that are probably most often found available. The prairie or tall blazing star that can get about very tall, about 5 foot up to, depending on the variety that you're growing or the location that it's growing in. Dotted is very drought tolerant. All of these are drought tolerant, but dotted is considered to be one of the most drought tolerant. And usually a shorter one, if you're growing where it is very drouthy, dry soil, it's probably only going to reach 2 feet, if even that. Meadow blazing star is the other one, 1 to 3 foot. One thing to make note of is voles love gay feather, or at least in a lot of our rain gardens where we've planted these. And the tall blazing star is the one that we recommend for rain gardens. These other two, if you have a wetter soil, they like it a little bit on the drier side and they don't tolerate it. But tall blazing star will perform okay in rain gardens. But we've lost quite a few of them because voles go in and they like to eat the corm. A complementary plant to gay feather is helenium, okay, or sneezeweed, another one of our natives. Named sneezeweed because the pioneers used to like to dry those flowers and like snuff and sniff them and make themselves sneeze because they thought it was healthy. I put in compass plant because this is it's a very tall one. It can get up to 9 feet tall. We have it in the Central Community College Columbus Pollinator Garden. That's a huge garden that can handle this size of a plant. And you can see how large and coarse those leaves are. Okay, but when I would go up and visit this pollinator garden, when this plant was blooming July to September, it probably had the most variety and diversity of pollinators. These were just a few of the pictures that I took of it. And so it's, again, you have to have a large garden, more of almost a prairie, which is like a CCC. This pollinator garden is huge. And so this works well there. A good complementary plant would be the Russian sage that's taller. Okay, maybe not the peekaboo one that I showed you earlier that went well with butterfly milkweed, but Russian sage, this would be just a very nice tall one, and they bloom at about the same time, and they would complement each other. Fall bloomers, I just have a few left and we can get to questions. Fall bloomers are extremely important for the late season foraging or collection of pollen and whatnot by bees. So Joe Pieweed is one of my absolute favorites. And I think I like it because it's just such a neat and tidy plant. I mentioned that with the shrub earlier, that I like plants that look nice and tidy and neat, even when they're not blooming. And this one sure fits that bill. And it's tall, even the tall one that can get up to 6 feet or taller. I'm sure they lodge under certain conditions, but I've certainly never seen them lodge or flop over like some of our taller perennials can do. Little Joe, this is Little Joe that you're seeing in the picture, only gets about 4 feet tall, maybe 5. And this is one that we do recommend in rain gardens, in the bottom of rain gardens, because it too will tolerate wet soils. And anytime I walk by it when it's blooming, you can hear the bees buzzing, and it's just alive with the butterflies flitting around. Goldenrod, of course, we have many different types of native goldenrod. Stiff goldenrod is the one you'll often see referenced in pollinator books, but one of those fall bloomers that's so critical. Wichita Mountain is a little bit different looking goldenrod, but is becoming a very popular one in perennial gardens. And correct me, Scott, but I think I've heard you say this is one of your favorites.
Yes, Wichita Mountains is a phenomenal one to keep.
Yep, and great for pollinators. I had to throw in showy stonecrop sedum because it's definitely a late season blooming one, good complementary to the goldenrods if you want them blooming at the same time. And no, it's not native, but I have it in a hail strip that I never water, and it does excellent. And when I walk by it, when it's blooming, flies, I mean, I've never seen the number of different flies that are on it. Painted lady butterfly a few years ago when we had so many of them were just massing on this. And of course, it's always full of bees as well. My last one is New England Aster, is a critical one, just a butterfly and bee magnet. And as you know, it'll bloom September up until frost. There's many different colors of New England Aster, white, blue, pink, magenta, and other colors. And again, in that fall, these things that are blooming late into the fall are so critical for that foraging and the collection to just food reserves in the fall to get them through the winter and so on. And for those, whatever mama bees are nesting and laying their eggs, they need that pollen to be able to collect it to make that pollen bread.